Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Step into the Pivot. As you know, we have wonderful guests on this show with big stories, and today is no different. I'm so honored and glad and grateful to welcome to our show Mr. Jeffrey, goes by Jeff Acheson, really impactful and influential industry leader. Jeff, we know you from the retirement industry space. You have spent over 4 decades as a respected, um, again, that word leader in financial services in general. You are very focused on guiding all kinds of retirement and investment strategies. I know you do that with a lot of purpose. And today you're here with us to talk about well, change, but not when it comes to modernizing retirement plans. I know that you've been recently spending also a lot of time, particularly focused on legal professionals as the CEO of the Advanced Strategies Group. But again, the innovation we're going to talk about here is more internal, because as you will tell us, and I'll let Teresa introduce you a little bit more, your most powerful pivot came not from business, but from matters closer to the heart. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Teresa to inquire you further.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jeff, for being here. We really appreciate it. And I think we're just going to kind of jump right in, but I know it's probably been right around 2 years in 2023 that you have said that you became a heartbroken dad for life. And I love that you said that. We really want this to be about your story and about Amber's story. So we're going to kind of let you tell the story as you want to tell it about your daughter, Amber.
Well, thank you. And yes, it has been almost exactly 2 years because that the anniversary of my daughter's passing, Amber, was her name, was this Saturday 2 years ago, and pretty much changed the perspective of where we've been, where you go, and those kinds of things. And you can't go through that kind of traumatic experience and not have some degree of change one way or another from there. I think the other thing that came into play, because we were very open about what my family went through with my daughter, it, I guess for lack of a better term, made other people comfortable or gave them permission to come forward and reach out, because our story is horrific and all of those things that we dealt with, but we're not the only ones. I mean, there's lots and lots of people that are dealing with those kinds of issues we'll talk about, and the impact of death and mortality and all of the things that play into that. So I have probably, Teresa, over the last 2 years, had close to 100 people that have reached out to me in one fashion or another, that felt empowered to say, hey, can you help me understand what I'm going through or what I'm dealing with, or just reaching out along those lines. And I always say we're all in the same storm, just some of us are in different boats, meaning that some people are going faster, some are slower, some are going in circles, some aren't moving at all, because everybody processes differently. And in our case, my daughter Amber died 2 years ago. She was 37. And it was a combination and a culmination of a lot of different things. And ultimately, it was health related. But as I'll explain in a minute, it started with mental health issues clear back as far as middle school. That in retrospect, you look back and say, oh, she's just being a teenager, she's just being a kid or temperamental. But it was really more than that. Then as time went on, again, you think you're on top of things going on in your household, but not always. But her case, alcohol became the self-medicating drug of choice. Nothing ever more exotic than that. It wasn't heroin. Some people have suffered through those. Crack. I mean, everybody has a different horror story that invaded their house. Ours was plain old alcoholism driven by vodka in that particular case. And that's a sneaky one, because you don't always catch it. Sometimes it's used on purpose. And I've given some talks in some schools about my daughter Amber and what we went through. And it was kind of interesting. I've had young ladies come up to me afterwards. And when I say young ladies, I mean middle school to freshmen, sophomores, that kind of thing, that say that in their household, it's the alcohol that's not the problem, or it is the problem. It's not the hard drugs or the things that get on TV a lot of times, because it's so socially accepted for alcohol to be around. And some people just do not have the physical characteristics to manage it, address it, process it, and it gets hold of them. And it's just as many times they're no more equipped to fight it off than any other disease that would come along. But and the reason I keep talking about it, and Teresa, I had a little bit of a twinge of tearing the scab off a minute ago when you said a brokenhearted, dad. So it's been 2 years, but it's in my family or my household, it's still kind of like yesterday as we'll go forward. And time they say heals all wounds, but it does not fill all holes. When you have a hole left by someone's passing, it's there permanently from there. And sometimes it's not as painful or as hurtful, but it never really goes away. And one of the things that I'm determined to do, and I'm very much into certain different philosophies, even apart and aside from religion. And you'll hear me talk about Ikigai, you'll hear me talk about Kaizen and some of the Japanese philosophy. And I'm a sucker for a good metaphor or an analogy, even though I don't know the difference between the two from there. But there's a saying is you die twice. Once when you physically leave this world, and the second time is when the last person on earth mentions your name from there. So in my daughter's case, I always look at it, she's not gone, she's just not here. And if I've got anything to do about it, it's going to be a very, very long time before her name's not mentioned again. And that's part of the problem that we all run into is how do you process grief, and how do you work around that hole that's been left in your heart? And for me, which is different than my wife, and it's different from my son-in-law and my grandson and those things, I had to get the energy of grief out of me. I had to use it. I had to put it to work doing something from there. So in retrospect, going back, as my daughter's progression went along and everything on the outside, she was happy, she was bubbly, she was a great person, people loved her, all those things. But inside, she did not see the same person that they saw. And the old saying is, the biggest battle every day is the person you look at in the mirror, and how do you feel about that person, and do you like who you see, and where it's going. So she always dealt with, and I'll go back to difference between mental health and mental illness. We have a focus a lot of times, particularly in the healthcare community, on how do you treat very diagnosed mental illnesses and medications and so on and so forth. But mental health is far more pervasive of an issue to deal with when you get into self-esteem and self-worth and imposter syndrome and confidence and what am I capable of, and how do I be my own person and control my own destiny and feel good about that, no matter what comes at me along those lines. And in Amber's case, she was in high school, she was an athlete, went through college, but unfortunately, as part of this mental health issue, there were things going on that we didn't see on the outside, nor did anybody else, because she was happy and carefree and bubbly and those things. But when she was alone, that's not who she was, and that's where the alcohol came in to help her quiet her spirit or quiet her soul and those kinds of things. But her body was not built to tolerate alcohol, so that led to eventually cirrhosis of the liver at a relatively young age. And then, unfortunately, in that progression of things, there was a couple of relationships. One was a marriage that just weren't healthy for her. So, kind of picking the wrong guys to be involved with. And that didn't help at all from there. The good news is I've got a wonderful, wonderful grandson that came out of one of those relationships. But, she paid the price of it in not physical abuse at all, but mental and emotional interactions that just fed into that self-doubt and low self-esteem. And then that compounded the self-medicating type of thing. And you can talk and coach. And in my early days back when I was a girls fast pitch softball coach, and we had one of the better teams in the state of Ohio, and we recruited from all over. And I coached my daughter on a team, but I loved that coaching aspect, so much. I even coached after she was done playing and took another round of girls through the system from about 14, 15 up to their 20s, from there. But I learned some interesting lessons there that I look back and are applicable to my daughter in particular. And I always had one of those that I had former players that helped me coach. I didn't have other dads as my assistant coaches and those kind of things. And I remember distinctly, and I've told this story many, many, many times, and I never get any women argue with me about it. So I guess it still remains true. But we had a tournament we were in, and there was probably 60 teams in the tournament. And we got all the way to the championship game, and we lost from there. And we went over to sign. The girls are down, and they're some of them are crying. It was a big deal from there. My two assistant coaches were former players of mine, and I said, I think it's time to have the talk, because we had another big tournament the next week. And they laughed. They go, yeah, it's time for the talk, because they'd heard it before when they were playing from there. So I went up, and they're sitting there on the ground, and remember, they're holding baseball bats. They could beat me at any time they wanted to from there. I said, I think the problem is you girls need to be more like boys. And all of a sudden, nobody was crying, and nobody's looking at the ground. They're glaring at me at that point, waiting for, okay, where are you going this with? I said, let me tell you how boys work. We'll do 10 things and be miserable 9 out of 10 times, terrible. And we'll get it right one time, and we'll talk about it for 30 or 40 years. Now, how good we were on that one given day way back when. I said, you girls, we had 60 teams. We got to the final 2, but you have a tendency to do 10 things, do 9 of them exceptionally well. I mean, stellar. And you're focused on the one time we didn't win. We didn't follow through. I said, we got to number 2 out of 60. You should be happy and probably celebrate the progress. Let's celebrate, where we got to. And then there was a proverbial, yeah, boys suck, they're stupid, all that kind of things, which I was relieved, because again, they had baseball bats. But I think my daughter was a very, very sensitive soul from that. And everybody is wired differently, and she was wired differently from the day she was born, being a bit of a colicky baby, and grew out of that. But one story I tell a lot too is she was working in high school in a fast food restaurant, and working in the window, and typical high school type job for a young lady or young man in that situation. And a group of boys in a car came through, and their order got messed up, and they were kind of the cool kids in the school, type thing, and just berated her about how stupid she was and the people that worked there to screw up a simple fast food order. And she's so dumb that, she's already reached the pinnacle of what her career opportunities are going to be and all of that. And I remember getting a call from her right after that, just in tears, and saying, why do they say things like that? It's so mean, and that was so hurtful. And you don't believe you don't believe that, do you? You don't believe they're right. And it was just, soul crushing. And if fathers could kill without going to prison, it'd probably be a different path for me in life from that point. But, I always told my grandson and nephews that don't be boys like that. And there's a whole saying of part of what we do with my daughter's memory is, kindness does matter, and be kind. And I'll come back to that here in a minute. But anyway, as time went on, she self-medicated. Fortunately, she finally met a wonderful guy. They got married, great guy. He's still part of our family, but we were so far down the path. And as I like to say, that on-ramp to the highway of pain, that once you're on that on-ramp, it's just hard to get back off of that particular highway. So the cirrhosis of the liver came up. We were trying to get a liver transplant, and she had trouble staying clean, as I like to say. So it kept bumping you off the list. And then unfortunately, she developed lupus that took out her kidneys. So now we've got a double organ thing going on. And then at the very end, again, because of alcohol, she had tripped and hit her head. And we ended up being in the hospital. And I was there for literally 4 months, every day, 12 hours a day, because she had 2 brain bleeds. They had to take off a piece of her skull to do the brain operation. So now we got 3 organs working against us in terms of kidney failure and dialysis, the cirrhosis of the liver, the brain issues. And then finally, 2 years, they came to me in the hospital and said, we got to make some hard decisions. It's just, you're not going to win this game from there. And so what are we going to do? Because I had the powers of attorney to make the decisions, because my son-in-law, for obvious emotional reasons, was just not in a place to do that. And so we made the decisions that we had to make, and we ended up in hospice. And as I said, the last day of her life, I went in, and I really didn't let anybody else go with me in that case, because I knew what the indelible impact that would have on emotions and memories and those kinds of things. But when I went in, and it's kind of a cosmic, heavenly sent, whatever. The hospice nurses, which are angels on earth, I've got such a respect for nurses, and particularly hospice nurses as well. But they were getting my daughter ready for what everybody kind of felt was the last day, and I had to kind of sit outside the curtains as they got her ready, because at this point she was in a fentanyl endorsed coma. And that's one of the things I talk about, whether it's alcohol or it's social media or it's fentanyl or it's guns or whatever it may happen to be. Used properly, they're wonderful, wonderful things. Used improperly, they'll kill you from that point. So the only thing that kept her from a very painful, miserable, dying process was the 2-liter bag of fentanyl on a drip, from that point. So for the last 4 days, that was just letting her body shut down without excruciating, pain. But when I pulled back the curtain, she had a nightgown on. And, the nightgown across it said, kindness matters. And then you have those flashbacks to bad relationships, to working in the fast food restaurant, to whatever it may happen to be. And one of those things I just know that when you interact with people, I learned and cemented in my being, if you will, you don't know that day what kind of day they're having, what kind of life they're leading, what kind of relationship you're in. You may be the last nice word that ever got sent to them. And it reminded me, I was doing this podcast today, and I got on the elevator in my building this morning, and there was a nurse going to work, and I knew that because it said registered nurse on her thing. Not that intuitive from there. I said, but I told her, I want to thank you for being a nurse. I said, I know how hard that job is, and I know what it's done for my family. So I just want you to know I appreciate you. And she looked at me like stunned. I mean, just looking down at her phone, and actually had to look up and talk to somebody, but it was like, wow. And I just walked away. I wasn't looking for a conversation or an interaction. I just wanted to leave her with something where, kindness matters as you went forward. So then when, Amber did pass away then, and coming back to what am I going to do with this, I contacted our local community foundation, and I said, look, I got to do something with this grief and this energy I have, and I can't just let this be the end. That's just not who I am, and it's not what I'm going to do with it. And everybody in my family will process the way they need to process and do what they want to do. But this can't be that way from that point. So they connected me with Ruling Our Experiences, and I met with Lisa Hinkleman, who's the founder of it, a PhD from Ohio State that worked a lot in women's crisis hotlines and helplines and all those kinds of things. And her research had boiled it down to these issues for women in particular. you can't start addressing them solely in 20s and 30s and 40s. You've got to get to those young ladies in their middle school, early high school years, because the environment we're in today, particularly post-COVID, is destroying young people, particularly girls, with peer pressure and social media and just all those things coming to be. And that's their whole program of getting in these schools and teaching skills and how to have good relationships, how to have good peer relationships, how to have good job skills, and all those kind of things. So I said, okay, I want to get involved. I don't know what I can do, but I'm going to do something, and I'm going to try to do really three things. One, raise awareness that sometimes it's just not kids being teenagers. There's underlying issues there that you need to be aware of and get a hold of and think through and talk through, and don't walk away from it, because it most of the time everybody will work their way through it, but there's going to be some that we don't. So you got to get through them, and I'll kind of close later with a story about that. And then number two, so I'm going to raise awareness. Number two, I know a lot of people. I'm fortunate to have a bit of a platform that I can get out there. And so we raised about $100 and some thousand in that first year. And in this program with ROCKS, which is the acronym for Ruling Our Experiences, it takes $100 to put one of these young ladies through their 12-week program. So it's not a crazy expensive thing from there. It's usually paid for by the school as part of their appropriations. But as we all know, schools are cutting back and they're looking for funding from those different things. So we kind of created the scholarship approach, if you will, because 100,000 divided by 100, we could put a lot of young girls through that particular program. So my friends across the industry and my family life, and so grateful to all of them who wrote checks, sent money, and got involved. And I said, and the third thing I'm going to do is try and raise advocates for you, because I know a lot of kick-ass women and guys, but women across the country that, as I tell this story and I have people call me, identify with Amber, and they identify what she went through, and they made it through. And but sometimes I've found, and hearing stories, they haven't made it all the way through. They're still flashing back, and they're still carrying that I always kind of say life gives you rocks, and you can put those rocks in. There's no acronym of rocks. I used to say it when it's ROCKS, but you can put them in a backpack and carry them through your life, and they weigh you down and slow you down. Or you can take the rocks out and throw them across the stream of difficulties and get to the other side much lighter and more capable of continuing on your journey from that standpoint. But I've had so many men and women who have come up to me and said, I'm 30, 40, 50. One person was 70 years old. He said, my wife is still dealing with those kinds of self-esteem and confidence issues. And he goes, she's 72 years old, and it's still an issue in our household from that point in time. So so I just knew I was on the right track from there. And then along that way, had gotten, but always have been, but Ikigai, which if you do start reading in that, is really finding your purpose in life. And it's your defined purpose. And there's books on it you can read. I've recommended a couple of them. There's one book, Ikigai for Teens. Whenever I would talk about Amber's program, I would pass that out and give it to the girls and put a note in there that Amber and I would be cheering them on, even though we may never see them again, just so they know somewhere out there they got a friend that's caring about them and looking forward to them, from that standpoint as well. So we worked with the folks at ROCKS, or Ruling Our Experience, which is based in Columbus, Ohio, and they are trying to expand nationwide. They've got chapters throughout the country, but not all over the country. So they created Amber's ACEs for ROCKS, and what ACEs stands for is Advocates and Champions for Expansion. So that's what we're really trying to do, is one, raise awareness. I'll keep ripping the scab off. I'll keep telling the story. I'll keep getting emotional. And I've had people come up to me that have said, I so appreciate you not hesitating or being ashamed or being apologetic about your daughter's issue. She suffered from mental health issues and alcoholism. But if we don't talk about it, it never gets fixed. It never gets addressed. So it's painful every time. It's emotional every time. But I'm going to keep tearing the scab off and keep talking about it. And that's where we'll avoid that, second death of Amber, of where she's not mentioned outside of the family anymore. And to kind of wrap up this long-winded run-on sentence that I'm pretty good at doing from that point, I had it at her funeral, and I had so many wonderful colleagues in the industry that showed up that you didn't expect it, flew in from Phoenix or flew in from Chicago. I'm like, what are you doing, here from there? But this was before we even got rolling on with what had happened along those particular lines. But I told a story about what we're trying to do, and the story is and some people have heard it, some people haven't, is the story of the Starfish and the young lady. And if you've read that, if you Google it or whatever, but basically there's an old man, not me at this point, but an old man decided to take a walk on the beach. He lived up on the bluffs, and he came down the steps onto the beach, and the tide had come in and the tide had gone out, and all these starfish were basically stranded on the beach on the sand. And as the day went on, the sun was basically going to bake them, and they would all die from that point. So there's a very small girl out there picking up the starfish and throwing them back into the ocean one at a time. And the old man approached her and said, "Young lady, what are you doing? You're wasting your time. Look up and down the beach. There's thousands and thousands of these starfish. You can't save them all. What you're doing doesn't matter." And he kept walking, and he heard the young girl mumble behind him, and he turned around and thought she was being disrespectful and said, "What did you say?" And she picked up another one and threw it into the water. And she goes, "It mattered to that one." So I think the real key is with the story we're trying to do with Amber's Aces for Rocks. I don't know that we'll change the world, we'll change the course of modern history, but every girl that we can get into that program, it may make a difference in the trajectory of her life, her career, her relationships. So as a couple of my huge supporters within the industry, Nicole Corning in Phoenix or Aaron Hall in Los Angeles, who have worked to open up Rocks chapters, or Dee Meyerhofer with SRP, who's been wonderfully supportive. We all have a theme of, we're saving as many starfish as we can, one at a time as they go along. So I think we all need a purpose in life, which is what Ikigai is, but it can't be all business. And sometimes it's not all personal, but in this case, like I said, Amber is not here, but she's not gone. I work for her, and she was never able to find her Ikigai in life. And my family talks about it a lot. Sometimes, unfortunately, someone's life purpose isn't discovered until they're after they're gone. So she continues on and lives through all of us and what we're trying to do. And I'm sure somewhere, somehow, she's looking down and very proud of her now of what she has accomplished in helping other people, because that's really all she wanted to do while she was here. Unfortunately, maybe her story had to be a bigger, different story, and she couldn't be here to share in it. So we try to find comfort and solace in that as we move forward. So that's kind of my pivot, where it came over the last, I wouldn't say 2 years. When she passed 2 years ago, that was a culmination of a lot of things over a lot of years. But we've just tried to turn it into lessons of evolution and lessons of learning, and just say, how can we leave the world a better place, one starfish at a time, as we go forward.